Your client-side JavaScript is starting to mold. It's starting to resemble a fat spaghetti code, and it is time to add structure, but it won't take too long. Gotta get your truth out of the DOM. Take your data in the models that you cannot lose. We'll render out your models with the help of the views. And if you don't want your JavaScript to end up like a mess, it's time for the anatomy of Backbone.js at codeschool.
You're watching the Anatomy of Backbone.js. This is level 7, Routers and History. So we have a little problem in our app right now. As you can see over to the right of each item, we have a little link. And we want that link to take us to a page that'll show just that one item. But we don't want to refresh the whole page. We actually just want to use a little bit of JavaScript, as you can see here, using something like jQuery, to just show that one item. Let's see what happens when we implement this link using plain jQuery. When I click on the link, I am shown just that one item. But now let's say I want to hit the back button to go back to the full list. Well, when I do that, I'm actually taken out of the entire app back to Google. This is not what we want. And actually, Backbone has this problem solved with the router and history. First, let's introduce Backbone's router. Now, the router's job is to map URLs to actions. As you can see here, we're creating a new router, and we're going to pass in a routes object. This is going to map a URL to a single action. In this case, when the URL is to-dos, the action will be index. And that index function is defined on the router. So when the URL in your browser is, say, /todos or #todos, the index action will be called. If you're unfamiliar with that # syntax, we're going to cover it a little bit later. Let's dive a little bit more into that routes object. As you can see here, we're defining a new route, and that's going to match todos/id and call the show action. But this ID is actually a parameter. It can be anything. For example, it can be todos1, todos2, todos hello, and that parameter that is matched will actually get passed to the show action. Let's look at a couple more route matchers that you can use in your routers. Our first one here is going to match search/query, for example, search Ruby, and that'll pass that one parameter into the action. The second one will actually match two parameters, the first one being query and the second one being paged, and both of those will get passed to the action. Same kind of thing with the third example here, where both name and mode will get passed to the action. And then there's a wildcard matcher, which will match everything after a certain point. So in this example, hello/world.txt will get set as the only parameter to the action. Now you may be wondering, how do we trigger these routes? Well, we can use the router's navigate function. With that, all we have to do is pass in the URL as the first argument. And if we actually want to trigger the action, we pass in trigger true. If we didn't pass in trigger true here, the browser URL would update, but our action would not be called. And of course, we can just use normal links. Unfortunately, these aren't actually going to work yet. And before we show you how to fix it, let's go back and see how people have solved this history problem before. You may be familiar with using the Gmail web client, and they solve history by using that # thing that I was showing you earlier. As you can see here, when I click on the starred, we're not actually doing a whole page refresh, but we are changing the URL to #starred. And this way, when you click back, it's not actually going to take you back all the way, it's just going to take you back to where you were before you clicked starred. Now, Basecamp Next does this a little differently, but in a similar way. Instead of using that # that Gmail used, they actually use a new HTML5 API called pushstate. And this lets them update the browser URL, and instead of using a #, it uses the regular /, so it looks like a real URL. Backbone will actually let you do both of these approaches to saving history in the browser. but I would suggest using push state. Now, browser support isn't great right now, but it's really close, and there's a lot of advantages to using push state, as I'll go over later. Let's go back to our backbone code. As we saw earlier, our navigate and our links weren't working yet. Now, to make these work, we first have to use the backbone history API. All we have to do is call backbone history start. And as you can see here, if we call start with no parameters, push state is going to be off, and our URLs are going to have that hash mark in front of them. And this is not great. Instead, when you call start, you can pass in push state true. And now when we navigate on our router, we'll have a slash in front of our URL instead of that hash mark. Let's take these concepts and implement our to-do app router. Here we're creating a router class, much like we did with models and collections and views. When we create that class, we pass in a routes object, and we're going to start out by defining the show action, which will match on to-do / the ID of the to-do. Now let's define that show action, accepting the ID as a parameter, and we're going to call this focus on to-do item function on a to-do list collection. This focus on to-do item function has already been defined, and all it will do is to reset the collection to show only the to-do item that matches the ID that is passed in. But you might be wondering where we're getting that to-do list from. Well, I'm going to define an initialize function on our router. This function takes an options object and will assign the to-do list to the router from the options. Now when we create our to-do router instance, we pass in an object with the to-do list collection. What happens if after the user goes to the show action, they hit the back button? Well, they're going to end up back on the root route, which has no URL. So we need to define the root route on our router. We do that by just using an empty string as seen here, and we want to call the index action when the root route is matched. Now when we define our index action, all we're going to do is call fetch on the collection. And this will get all the to-do items from the server and display that to the user. Now let's see our router in action. As you can see here, we've got a list of to-do items. And when I click on that link, I'm shown just that one to-do item, and our URL in the browser has been updated. Now when I hit the back button, I'm going to go back to the root route, and my list is going to refresh. And I can click on other links and go back and forth, and the history works as we expect. To finish it all up, we can use our router as a good place to organize some of the code that we've been writing. Instead of defining a whole new router class, since we're only really going to have one router instance, let's just go ahead and create the router instance directly. Now we have our routes that matches our root route to the index action, and our to-do / ID to the show action, just like before. When we initialize our router, we will go ahead and create a new to-do list collection. Then we will create our to-do list view and pass in that collection. The last thing we need to do in initialize is append that collection views element to our DOM. We're going to define a new function called start, and all that's going to do is call backbone history start with push state true. Next, our index function, which we've seen before, and our show function as well. The really neat thing about using our router to organize our code this way is when our page first loads, we can use the jQuery ready function, and all we have to do is call todoapp.start, and that'll start our whole app, and everything will be initialized and we'll be good to go. Well, that's it for level 7, routers and history. I hope you enjoyed the course. Now you have some more work to do, but I'm out of here.